Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to ask us to go ahead and get started for this afternoon session. Oh, sorry, a few folks still clearing out from lunch. But I want to make sure we have 3 speakers in this particular session, and I think all of them have some very important things to say. So I want to make sure that we give them an adequate amount of time. So this is continuing the same morning session that we had related to the challenge of large data, and I will take the note from Bill Mitchner that we should also put a little caret in and say that it's the challenge of complex data as well. So we have 3 speakers in this session, and our first speaker is Mears Krozas from Harvard University, who will be talking to us about her organization's, I think, fascinating work related to the Dataverse project. So what I'd like to do is hand it over to Mears. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Do you have a remote? Hi, everybody. Yes, I'll be talking today about the Dataverse network. And in particular, I will show how in this project we combine the importance of scholarly recognition with the professional and archive infrastructure to provide a system that allows publishing data sets. And I hope it will answer some of the questions that were discussed in the session before. And we'll have a discussion later on. So before I get started, I just want to point out that this work is done at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University with the software development group there, and with the contribution of Gary King and Micah Allman as researchers that have given a lot of ideas to the initial design of the project. The main focus is social science, although our idea is to apply that to any field. First of all, what we think is the problem with data is that there are 2 main groups that are interested in data, but their focus is different. One of the groups is the professional archives. They want to make sure that the data is preserved forever, and that means assigning persistent identifiers to data, making sure that it's reformatted in a way that is independent of their software package, providing backups and recovery, providing standards for metadata conversion, in general for preservation. And there is the other group, there is the researchers, data authors, collectors, data owners, that will be more interested in making sure that they get the recognition of for the data. They get also some amount of branding and visibility from the data. And also, either through scholarly citation, formal data citation, have some ownership of the data sets, through be able to update it and not just give it away to archive and not have then control anymore over the data sets. Provide also the level of restrictions to the data that they want with the terms of use that they want. So basically, one of the problems is the data owners don't give the data, they don't share the data enough, and they don't give it enough to the professional archives. Archives at the same time probably don't get as much data from owners because they're not supporting the needs of the authors. So what we try to do with the Dataverse network is provide solutions through technology. And the system combines all these sets of features. So it has a centralized archival infrastructure that gives the persistent identifiers, the backups, and researchers basically don't need to worry about that part, and they just say they upload that data and this is done for them. And at the same time, they get in a distributed way, they get the recognition and control they want with the branding and all the ownership of the data. So I'll go on and show different use cases that will hopefully demonstrate how we accomplish that with the Dataverse. So the first case is the Dataverse for researchers. We have a number of Dataverses now from faculty at Harvard and other universities all over the world. Basically, they can create a Dataverse easily that will have the same branding as the website, and they can upload the data there, but still the Dataverse it becomes as part or is embedded as part of the website. How they get recognition? So give the credit through a generated formal data citation that contains the authors as the first part of the citation format, and then I'll go on into in another slide in more detail what the rest of the data citation. But basically, it gives credit mainly to the authors, but also to distributors, producers, etc. And then it gives the other thing that is important to researchers, that is this control and ownership of the data sets. It tries to allow that in a way that is as easy as possible. So researchers just created a Dataverse that is basically their own space or website for data. And it adds a study, and a study can contain multiple files. So it can contain the data sets, but also the software that help generate that data set, documentation that describes helps to complement the data, but also it has a set of cataloging fields that can be entered by the researcher. And there are only a few that are required, but there are a lot more that can be added, and it will help to more easily discover that data. Can also set the permissions and the terms of use, or how to just, even though we have some terms of use that are applied to all the Dataverse network, every Dataverse owner can set the additional terms of use. And then it chooses to release the study, and that makes the data set public or at least published, and maybe with some restrictions. The use case two is the Dataverse for journals. So, and there are now a few Dataverses also in the IQSS Dataverse network that are specific for journals. And in this case, the data that is there helps or supports publication in a journal. So it allows others to replicate the results from the publication. And since the study in the Dataverse allows not only to have the data set, but also all the documentation and everything else that is needed to replicate the work, it gives a complete solution for data replication. So one of the things that is important for the journal is to have a way to link or connect the journal, the publication itself, to the data set. And this is done again through the data citation. In the data citation, we have a persistent identifier that is now, for now we're using handles. This is a persistent URL, basically, that is comparable to the DOI. And we're interested also in supporting DOIs, but it satisfies the same needs. And then another part of the citation is the universal numerical fingerprint that helps verify the data. I'll explain a little bit more how the numerical fingerprint is created. This citation is generated, again, automatically as soon as the author or the data owner uploads the data set to the Dataverse. And the process for journals is a little bit different than in a Dataverse for a researcher, because in that case there is a curator or moderator that will help to review the data sets that their authors upload, and it decides when it wants to release the study. But authors still have the option to edit and add more data anytime in the future, and it always goes through this review process. In In the third use case, show Dataverse for archives. In this case, archives are interested in not losing any information, basically. And we provide that through giving versioning to the data sets, to the study that includes the cataloging and the data sets. So previous versions of a study can be still cited, and although the latest the citation without the version will go into the latest version of the data set. It also supports the accession so that the studies and the data is never lost, never permanently destroyed. And then the numerical fingerprint, which basically works following way. When a data set is uploaded for certain formats, and in this case it's for formats that are more relevant in social science, we process the data set and we extract all the variable metadata, all the format metadata from the actual data values. And then to the data values, we apply the necessary algorithms to get this string that it's like a checksum, but the big difference is that it applies to the content of the data set, only the content. So if you change the format of the file, it doesn't change the UNF, the numerical fingerprint. But if you change the content, any value does change the numerical fingerprint. And in this case, by doing that also, since we reformat the data file, we then store it not only in the original format, but in a format that is independent of the software package that it came with. And the idea of doing this all automatically is to, again, make it easy for researchers or data collectors upload the data in the way that they work on it, but do all the preservation work by the system. And another aspect that is important to archives is the supporting of standards and backups, and we do that through from one of the parts is supporting the OAI PMH for harvesting metadata from either a Dataverse network to another Dataverse network or another system that supports OAI. The data in this case is exported in variable formats, XML formats, like DDI is the Documentation Data Initiative, also relevant in social science, but it can apply to other fields, Dublin Core, FGDC for more geospatial data, MARC, etc. And also we support logs, which is the lots of copies, keep stuff safe. And this allows to replicate all the data sets in multiple locations, or at least enables that to set it up in a way that it makes it easy to have the data replicated. Again, the researcher data collector doesn't need to worry about all that, but since there is a centralized archive, this is all done for them. And the last one use case for Dataverses that we just released recently, and it's somewhat experimental, is what we call the Wiki Dataverse. And in this case, is a more collaborative way of improving the data and contributing to data. There is this one case for election data archive that a couple of researchers at Harvard and MIT are putting together, and it will be released in a few weeks. But the idea is that in this case, if you go through the process, any contributors can go and update the same study, add new data files to the study, improve the cataloging, which sometimes is one of the issues, how much cataloging is done by the researcher, but others can contribute and improve it. And there is always a moderator that will review those changes and release or will not accept the changes. So we'll see how that works. The current usage now of the Dataverse network is at Harvard. we have, the instance that we have installed, hosted there, provides about 257 public dataverses. It changes every day, more or less. So there are maybe 300 more non-released dataverses that are getting prepared. Those are mostly from, again, researchers from across the world, but also some of them for archives or journals, as I showed here, or research groups. There are about 36,000 studies, and each study can contain one or more files, so there is about 640,000 files. And then there are several other installations, and now some of them are already in production, and some are getting tested to get in production soon across the world in large institutions, other universities. Most of that, as I said, was in social science. There is a lot of interest now from different groups in biomedical research data to extend the Dataverse to work well with that data. As it is now, it can already be used for that data, but it would not be ideal in terms of the reformatting of data files as we do for SPSS and Stata data files that are usually commonly used in social science. Basically, how to get started is easy. You can go to the Dataverse network at IQSS at Harvard, and just from the front page, create a Dataverse. Also, if what you would, in that case, you don't need to install any software, and you have your Dataverse with all the centralized archiving in our location, but still with all the ownership and control of the Dataverse from your side. But if you want an installation of the Dataverse network, then you can download in the software that is open source, free, obviously, and in the data.org. And also you can contact me for anything directly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maris. So we're actually going to plan to take the questions after all three presentations, so we can go ahead and move on. I also would like to say congratulations to Spain, which is where Maris is from. So we should all say congratulations to your team. It was a fantastic victory.
Wow, yeah, it was very challenging because I had to take the plane just when the last goal. The only goal was scored, so I missed the goal. But anyway.
All right, well, my next introduction, I'll make no references to football for you, okay, I promise. But Liz Lyon from the Digital Curation Center, from Bath, and responsible coordination with the Data Curation Center in the UK. And so it's, I think, a fantastic kind of set of case studies of what has been done on that level. And then I'll switch to slides, Liz. I'll get that done for you. But and then making reference specifically to the overarching role that the DCC plays in the specific kind of case studies that they approach as well. So I'll hand it over to Liz.
Okay, thank you very much, and pleasure to be here. I'm assuming that my slides are going to magically pop up.
They are.
Yeah, so as Lee says, I'm wearing my Digital Curation Center hat today, and what I want to do is to give you three sort of illustrations, if you like, of what's happening in research data management in the UK. I want to start off with looking at an exemplar in the structural sciences and look at how people are finding challenges in moving data across facilities. And then I want to do something of a reality check and look at what's happening in our institutions right at the coalface in terms of research data management. And then finally, I'm also going to pick up on the credit thread and look at how we can incentivize data management. Okay, so the first of these projects is I2S2, Infrastructure for Integration in the Structural Sciences. And what we're looking at here is the challenges that a researcher faces when they want to move their crystallographic data, so I'm thinking about chemical crystallography here, across institutions, perhaps from their local lab to something like a central facility like a synchrotron. And I'm going to say a little bit about what we found in the challenges in this area. And actually, long term, what we're thinking about is how we can get cost-benefit gains from improving the processes and the standards and the models that underpin this process. Because in such a challenging economic climate, the big question is, about the money at the end of the day. Can we make savings? Can we improve value from public investment in research in these areas? So this is a project that's being led by my organisation as well as Southampton, and I know I've got colleagues from Southampton here, along with Cambridge, STFC and consultancy. So let's look at some of the infrastructure. So over here we've got the Diamond Light Source. So this is a global synchrotron facility at Rutherford Appleton Labs. Over there we've got a diffractometer that's part of the National Crystallographic Service at the University of Southampton. And over here, this is a bit of infrastructure as well. This is Martin Dove, who happens to be one of the Earth Sciences researchers at the University of Cambridge, and that's some human curation infrastructure. So you're all infrastructure, and that's actually where the most challenging part is. So the first thing we did was we looked at what was happening in each of these facilities around data management. And so on the left here, I've got some of the functions, the activities, if you like, and this sort of table gives a summary of what we observed in each of those facilities that was happening. And without going through all of this, I just want to pick up on a few points. So over there, we've got people like Martin Dove, who's perhaps a researcher working in quite a small team at the coalface, who wants to send their sample perhaps to the National Crystallographic Service, or perhaps wants to get some beam time analysis on the synchrotron. And they've got to fill in a myriad of forms in order to get that sample, that sample that relates to the data processed through. So that's a bureaucratic hurdle. Over here, let's assume that they get some analysis time. They then generate some data, some raw data and some results data. So these are multi-billion-pound synchrotron facilities, and the results are taken off. I meant to have a stick in my hand at this point. The results are taken off on a USB stick. So there's some interesting risk issues associated with that. And then whilst the National Crystallographic Service has got quite an established metadata schema for describing crystallographic data, there's quite a lot of questions around what the standards are that are being used at other locations. So lots of challenges and lots of work to do there. So, press the button again. The next thing we've been looking at is thinking about how those different activities fit together in some sort of life cycle model. And we're talking about a research life cycle model. And this rather complicated picture is our current instantiation of that. So let me take you through it very rapidly. So there's 4 different types of activity we've identified. The blue boxes are research activity. The orange boxes are administrative activity. Green is curation activity, and pink is publication. So we've thought about what the researchers do at each of the point in their research cycle, and we've tried to capture that. And in general, this cycle sort of works in a clockwise direction, but the other thing to say is there are iterative parts of it, especially around the blue line there. And the other thing to say, which is pretty obvious, is it's complicated. So what are we doing next? What we're going to do now, and we've started doing this, is we're starting to think about what are the standards and existing data models that underpin some of these parts of the cycle. So let's look at some of them. So over there in the research management area, we've got Serif, okay? In the middle, around data management and provenance, we've got the core scientific metadata model, which is a large facilities-based model, and we've got open provenance model. Down here, there's a few question marks around software descriptions. We haven't quite sorted that one yet. Over here, publication, we've got FRBA, we've got SWAP. Around curation, we've got the fairly well-established Open Archival Information System reference model and standards like Premise. We've had Dublin Core mentioned already, and we've got ontologies around data discovery. But there's actually a bit of a gap here around data process, around that area that's left blank there. So that's the area we're going to concentrate on. So what we're doing at the moment is thinking about how we can establish a data model that describes what we're calling an open methodology, part of the research activity cycle. And we're going to develop a data model working with other people that are already working in this area. So there's the ORChem work at Southampton that we're going to join up with, and I know that Microsoft is involved in that. And there's also the Data Conservancy project, which is the other DataNet project that Bill mentioned this morning. Carla Gozzi at Cornell is also working on data models, so we're going to join up with all of that work. So that's a quick snapshot of what's happening in this particular project to give you a flavour of the sorts of data challenges that we're observing. Let's go back to the requirements report, because I said this was going to be a reality check. That's a quote from that report, which has been recently published. So what it's observed is the greatest need is for a robust data management infrastructure which supports each researcher in capturing, storing, managing and working with all the data generated during an experiment. And our observation is that that doesn't exist at the moment. That joined up, coordinated data infrastructure just does not exist. So this is another project that the Digital Curation Centre has been involved with. It's called Incremental. And this one's led by the University of Cambridge and the University of Glasgow. And what they've been doing is going into institutions there, speaking to faculty, and asking them a series of questions about how people right there at the coalface in your institution manage your data. And they've looked at 5 different areas. And let me give you a flavour of the sorts of things that they've found. So here are some wonderful quotes from that report. And my absolute favourite one is this one here. I just back everything up onto data sticks. I didn't even know you could back up onto servers. So these are real quotes from real researchers at these institutions. And we've also heard today that researchers don't share. That's absolutely right. They do not like to share their data. It's like giving away their baby. But there is some hope in that lots of people said, we really would like some guidance. We need some help here. Also, something else that's been mentioned, in parallel, the research funding organisations are putting out some guidelines. They're actually starting to ask for data management plans. So we've heard NSF been mentioned already today, and the Wellcome Trust, which is one of the largest UK biomedical charities, is also requiring a data management and sharing plan if you want to get some of the Wellcome Trust funding. So let me tell you a little bit about what the Digital Curation Centre has been doing to try and provide some guidance to help people out there in the field. And can I just do a quick check here in this room? How many people in this room have created a data management plan?
In the process.
Oh, there's a few hands up. Okay, well that's very, very reassuring. So in the UK, we've got about 7 research councils, and they all have different policies on data sharing and data management. So the first thing we did was we had a look at those policies and synthesized the requirements and put them together into this checklist. So this was a series of questions, quite probing questions, aimed at asking a researcher about their data management. And those are the sorts of areas that we covered. So it was, what sort of formats are you going to be using when you create your data? What sort of standards will you be using? Are there any ethical concerns? What are the IPR issues and so on? So we did this a little while ago. We put it out to the community to see what they thought of it. And we got some feedback. And the next step, which is happening now, is that version 3 is being created as an online tool. So a data management planning online tool aimed at researchers everywhere to help them to manage their data more effectively. But really, this is just the first step in this process, and it's a long road, I think. So we need to get data management plans embedded in the research life cycles right across the piece, and also in funder policy. But this isn't a policy talk. There's also something around having a good code of practice. So the UK has a code of practice published by the research councils, but I think it needs to be improved. And this Australian one, if you haven't had a look at that, that's really good. It quite clearly defines what a researcher should do and what an institution should do around research data management. So, okay, you've got your data management plan. It's submitted to the funder as part of the proposal writing process. That needs to be reviewed and assessed in just the same way as the intellectual content of the science is reviewed. And that means that the reviewers need some training and some guidance in the same way so that they know how to approach this. So we're working with the social sciences to develop some guidance aimed at reviewers of these data management plans. Then there's a whole question around compliance, and I'm not going to go there because that's not what this talk's about, but there is a question about compliance. It would be really nice to be able to see data management plans from other disciplines, and so we need some sort of infrastructure, whether it's a registry or a repository or whatever, to share data management plans. And then right further down the other end of the line, we need to do some cost-benefit analysis to see what the benefits are of having data management plans embedded in researchers' life cycles so that we can actually get some hard economic benefits and value from this activity. So there we are. We've got data management plans up there in our research activity life cycle. So that's good. But what about incentivizing this? And there has already been quite a lot of discussion about how we can incentivize data management, because quite often the researchers think, oh, this is going to take me away from the real research that I want to do. So there have been a number of calls in the professional press for different ways of incentivizing data management, calls about citation, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Phil Bourne in PLOS Computational Biology developed a scholars factor, a new metric, which took into account things like database entries, software, wiki entries, blogs. And so there's clearly quite a groundswell about this. Now, we also, in the UK, have a research assessment exercise. It's called the Research Excellence Framework. And at the moment, you don't get credit for your data as part of that assessment framework. So there are a number of things that need to be addressed here. But if we think about data citation, as has already been mentioned, it's not straightforward. We can cite at the what I'm calling the macro level there. We're used to citing papers and articles, but actually we need to be able to cite a workflow. We need to be able to cite a complex model like that one there, the visualization of that model, the data that underpins that model. We might want to be able to cite an annotation, and we might actually want to be able to drill down and cite a concept, which is what the Concept Web Alliance is proposing in RDF terms. So my final example here is some work that we've been doing with SAGE bionetworks. And there have been quite a few papers now talking about how we can develop new mechanisms to look at the occurrence of disease and track how that's going to happen. And the SAGE Bionetworks is a not-for-profit organisation that's looking to free up and to open up genomic data, clinical trials data, to make it openly available in the SAGE Commons so that these sorts of networks can be developed more effectively and used to predict disease. So they come from quite complex pipelines, data pipelines. And we've been starting to look at how we can cite some of these bionetworks. So here's a Taverna-based pipeline. This is probably a fairly simplistic picture, but it gives you the idea that there are multiple data sets, there are multiple stages in the pipeline. There's a Cytoscape up there top in the middle, which is the visualization software. And so we need to be able to cite all of the aspects in that workflow. So we've started to think about how best to do this. We're developing a citation framework which has a number of parts in it. So we can think about the data down there at the bottom left-hand part of the triangle, some of which may be in the Sage Commons repository, but some might be in many distributed repositories. We can think about the process. So that's that blue set of blue boxes in that earlier research life cycle, or a Taverna workflow in this particular instance. And we can think about how we use the citations linked to publications, the interpretation of the data, if you like. So we're hoping to work with Nature Genetics and PLOS Computational Biology in this piece of work. And we'll be looking at not just DataCite, but also other mechanisms for data citation so that we can see which is the most appropriate to apply to this particular use case. Okay. So I'll wind up by summarizing with a few take-homes. As I say, the infrastructure at the moment in pretty much any discipline, I just chose structural sciences there because we've been working in that area. It's not seamless at the moment, it's not joined up, and it's not coordinated. So there's lots of work we need to do, and particularly around the methodology of moving a sample around that space. We've seen that researchers in the faculty need help. We're hoping to provide some of that help with a data management planning tool. And we need to incentivize data management. And part of that is providing the technology to do it, but part of it is also changing culture. And that is far, far, far harder than providing a few technical tools. So I will close with a plug for a conference that's happening in December in Chicago. And this is the International Digital Curation Conference. Participation and practice is the theme, which is particularly pertinent, I think. And we've got a great lineup of speakers, and there's also an opportunity for you to submit your papers to that conference. So I very much hope to see you in Chicago in December. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liz. Appreciate it. I'd like to now go ahead and invite up John Wilbanks, who's the Vice President for Science at Creative Commons. I think he's going to be shifting gears a little bit and probably covering a few of the meta issues that span some of these more practical presentations we've seen before, and perhaps even dabbling in policy a little bit. But I'll get your slides ready.
Okay.
So welcome, John.
Thanks. So I'm lucky because I get to go after Deb and Bill and Liz and Marissa, and I can hopefully bring some of these things together. And I'm not a computer scientist, although I spend a lot of time around. What I do is work on the policy and the legal issues, and to a certain extent some of the technology issues that surround the sharing of intellectual property and other kinds of property on the web for science. So that means copyrighted stuff like journal articles, it means data and databases, it means actual physical research materials like stem cells, and it also means going all the way to patents. And so we've spent a lot of time over the last 6 years looking at what it would take to get to this data web concept. And I've got it in quotes because I think one of the problems we have is that we rather naively assert that some of the things that work for documents are going to work for data. When we've had 300 plus years of culture on how to use documents in science, we've had maybe 25, 30 years of big data. That's less than a single career lifespan for a scientist. And we don't have the norms or the culture, much less the technology, to do a lot of the things that I think people expect in a data web. So is this working here? There we go. So Tim, so I worked for Tim at the Web Consortium for a while. He got this famous TED Talk where he had the whole audience chanting raw data now. Right? Suddenly, like, my mom sent me an email saying, "Oh, this is what you do, right?" And it's a very exciting talk, and actually I know that like Jim Hendler got people chanting raw data now at another conference recently. You sort of see it twittered and talked about all the time, but you know, this is what they show you when they say that we're about to have the data web and raw data now, and this is the linked data graph, right? And if you actually dig into this, right, so here's the gene ontology down here, and then like very close to it in the graph is the RDF book mashup, and US Census data and music brains. Right, so this data may be linked, but I don't think it's linked in a useful way. Right, you can't run a query and ask a scientific question. You can't build a model out of it. Right, so if it's linked trivially in many cases. And that's one of my beefs with the data web or the memes around the data web. I actually believe deeply in the importance of a data web. Right, we spend a lot of time working on trying to build it, but it's a lot harder than just linking a bunch of stuff up into a single graph. Right, and this is sort of what I've tried to simplify the assumption set around the data web that I keep running into, which is if we've got RDF and NULL, and we've got open source software, and then the data is under something like a Creative Commons license or a free software license, then that's enough. Right, and we'll get this magic Metcalfe's law applied to data, and boom, the data web will happen, right? The fact that we don't have visualization for data that's effective, the fact that we don't have anything that's like a web browser for data, right? The fact that our entire culture is document-based and that made it easy for us to become the web culture, and we don't have that for data. None of that really applies. It's all just sort of like, okay, RDF, open source, let's go. And so I'd love for that to be true. I would love nothing more than to be the sort of skeptic who's proven wrong, because that would be awesome. But we've spent a fair amount of time analyzing community after community that have begun to approach a data web. And it's a lot more than RDF. And it's really boring stuff that tends to offend the people who believe in the simple system. Right? We've been criticized for being a little too dogmatic and a little too focused on scale in the life sciences, for example. But we have some pretty good reason for that. And so here's the International Virtual Observatory Alliance. This is one of my favorite examples of a community that's actually getting towards their own data web. Right? Now, this is the list of technical specifications, the most stable version, whether they're in process, and the version history. And this is just for astronomy. This is, compared to a lot of other things, it's moderately stable data. Right? Data you gathered 50 years ago is still sort of useful and interesting. But this is just the recommendations for the IVOA. Right? Here are the notes. Right? And each one of these things, like this little tiny thing down here is the ontology of astronomical object types. If you've ever been part of an ontology construction effort, you know how painful that one note was to write. Right? This is, and I cut this off, right? It keeps going. Right? This is how many notes, right? The first one was specs. This is notes. Right? This is their document standards process. That's a clip of the submission log. Right? Just for astronomy, just to make the data reuseful and interpretable for people in astronomy. That's how far the community has had to go. Right, so linking it up, stitching it together with a little bit of RDF doesn't let you do that. Right? The hard part isn't technology. It's the social decisions that have to get encoded in technology about how you're going to work together, how you're going to describe things, what names you're going to give things, and how you're going to publish them. So this is a good example of the sort of thing that's going to happen again and again and again, community by community by community, as we make our way towards a data web. And it's boring. Right? It's really boring. It's really annoying. There's almost no reward for it. Right? None of these people probably got publications out of this saying, well, I spent 25% of my time wrangling with people over what the definition of a quasar was. It was a labor of love. It's an unrewarded thing. Right? We train people in science to measure data and to analyze it. We don't train them to become stewards of it, and we don't reward them for that. So thankfully, in some communities, people do this out of the love of the field. Some do it just because they're obstinate. Right? But this is how the data web actually comes into being, at least in our opinion, in the sciences. And so this is what we really think the chant needs to be. Right? And it's nowhere near as sort of pithy. And then this sort of pervades everywhere. The program managers who fund science, right, don't get rewarded for funding data archives. They get rewarded for funding projects that result in high-impact papers, for projects that result in patents, right, for Flash. Right? That's the way that our entire system is built. They get rewarded for things that create documents, not things that create data. We don't have any of the ways to measure that interstitial systems value. This is what we heard about in the last 4 talks. And so you take something like climate change, right? And this is, I've been sort of floundering into climate sciences over the last couple of months for a variety of reasons. And I'm just sort of stunned at what a perfect test case it is for a lot of these open sciences. I come out of the life sciences. And we sort of think that we're special, right? That our science is a snowflake. Climate science has almost all the problems of human health in terms of complicated evolved systems going on over time with intervention. But it doesn't have the patent problem. So it's actually a lot nicer in many ways to study these things. And when you start looking at things like the phonology network or the flux stuff that got cited earlier, right, you've got these massively complicated systems where each of the data sources have been gathered independently. Each of them has already begun modeling, and you've had to start coupling the models one to another in order to sort of answer questions. The question that got posed to me as an example last week was, we know that the temperatures are going to rise 4 to 7 degrees Celsius over the next 40, 50 years. Well, we know that's going to lower the amount of snow that falls in the Cascade Mountains, which is going to lower the snowpack melt into the Columbia River Gorge. And by 2050 or so, the climate scientists, at least at Oak Ridge, are saying you can't have any new urban development in Seattle, right, assuming agriculture stays stable, because there's no more water. So when do we start building really, really expensive plants to do desalination? Right? That's the kind of question that only a data-driven predictive model can answer. And you need to be able to look back at old data and see whether or not your model accurately predicts the old data. You need to be able to understand the bias that creates, since the conditions when the old data would have been right no longer hold. And you need to be able to access all the new data as it comes out to see which of the models have been predicting accurately as they go along. There's a million different things you need to do with this sort of data. But all of them demand that boring documentation, metadata, stewardship, revisioning, citation, all of those aspects that contribute to an ecosystem where part of my value as a scientist comes from publishing data, right? Not sharing data, but publishing data as a first-class object equivalent to a paper that gets citations and gets rewarded. So what I wanted to sort of, that's why all my build-up, right? What I wanted to do is think a little bit about what happens if we're successful. So let's sort of punt and say, magically, we get standards and we get all of these metadata systems, we get incentives, and we start to have an internet or a web for data. What can stop it? Right? Even as hard as this is, let's assume we make it. And so this is a great book, if you haven't read it, by a guy named Jonathan Zittrain, who got attacked by the Daily Beast like in the last week for being anti-Apple, so he must be popular here. But his core theory is that there are things that make systems generative, and openness is one of those things that makes a system generative. But a big part of the power of a generative system is that anybody can add to it. Anybody can write code to it. And so like Windows is an example of a generative system because it got connected to the internet by a guy who just wrote trumpet windsock. It didn't have to ask permission. Whereas the iPhone is a more closed and less generative system because you've got to get permission to write your apps. But he's really focused on these ideas of when you achieve scale, one of the things that happens immediately is the same characteristics that made it possible to build the system can actually make it possible to stall the system. And he's arguing in many cases that's happening on the internet now. So I wanted to do the back half of my talk thinking about what are those things for data? What could they be for data if we actually got a data network going? And sort of, and this is a bit of an homage to Larry Lessig and the 4 things that regulate a person on the internet. So what are the things that regulate data? And this is an artificial compression. I'm in a room of computer scientists, I know that. It's an artificial compression for the sake of argument. But what we've done is we think there's 4 key elements that regulate data. So one is technology, obviously. That's what we've been hearing about: standards, annotations, formats, metadata, and so forth. One is the actual privacy issues around the data. And these are things that could be privacy in the sense of people. It could be privacy in the sense of secrets. Not wanting to have lots of copies of data floating around because they don't have unique fingerprints, and you're worried that different versions of the data set are going to circulate. Maybe it's because you want to know who's got copies of the data set for national security reasons. There's lots of reasons why data can't be truly public, and that's a big regulator. Policy is another regulator. We've heard about the welcome policy that's going to require data sharing. Right? Those policies are an important piece of this. Policy also encodes the amount of funding that goes in to any sort of data information system. And then intellectual property is a regulator. I'm going to argue it is the least important regulator. But unfortunately, since we come from the web culture where we say IP enables open software, IP enables open culture, therefore IP should enable open data. And I don't have any good answers at all for the other three, but I think I have a good answer for IP. So when you think about IP in relation to data, usually it's copyright that we start with because it's copyright that we're comfortable with. If we've ever written open source software or used a Creative Commons license, sort of have a sense, well, I want that, but for data. Because data can't be that different than software or a photograph or so right? It can't be, right? It's such an easy metaphor for us to grasp that it's almost instinctive. Right? For 5-6 years, people have said, when will you release a Creative Commons license for data? But the reality is that we don't build federated queries out of 1 billion photographs. And therefore, we've never run into the issue of mandated legal attribution to 1 billion people. Copyright in this country lasts 7 years after you die. If we build something on data on copyright, we're going to have these basically cascading and ballooning chains of legal requirements to do attribution. Right? And that's if we use the softest licenses, just the attribution licenses. If we start to get into things like viral copyleft style database licensing, right? What does that even mean? What if I didn't even make a copy of the data? What if I ran my query on your server because it was federated? Does that requirement now propagate to everyone who uses the results of my query, yea, unto 70 years? Right? It's not the right metaphor for data. And the thing is that because we use it this way, it has all these weird interferences. So let's say I impose a copyleft style IP license on a data set that's carrying human subject privacy constraints. Am I required to share it, to put it back onto the web under the same terms? Right? These things haven't been thought out yet. And in many ways, applying the same concepts from the web that we apply is one of the ways that we can stall the generative cycle. Because if we try to assert too much control in the name of freedom because it worked in software and because it's worked in culture, it can actually have the negative impact on the data web. Because if you looked at some of the examples we had today of how complicated the workflows are, how complicated the norms are, how complicated citation is, if we introduce a layer of complexity that is purely intellectual property based, we can turn this very quickly into an NP-hard problem. Right? Now, technology is painful, but it's actually easier. So this is something we did. We didn't want to do a purely theoretical exercise in semantic web, in data integration, and in database theory and policy. So we took a bunch of databases and ontologies and resources from the life sciences, and we decided to wire them together using RDF to see exactly what the limitations and the capabilities of the technology were. We've been doing this for 5 years. It's called the NeuroCommons. You can go download this. The whole idea is that data integration should be more like building a Linux distribution. You can basically patch in a new database into the integrated batch, the same way that you would patch in a new piece of software or a new piece of code into a Linux distro. And if you don't like what we've done, if you're not into ontological realism or if you're not into the way that we do names, you can just fork it. Right? We don't have the user support to make changes on behalf of people, but it's free. You can take it and do whatever you want with it. So we did, all sorts of boring mappings, like mapping PubMed IDs for papers to all of the gene IDs. Right? That's in the XML at NCBI way in the back. Right? We mapped gene IDs to, PubMed IDs to mesh headings, so that you could now begin to go from gene IDs, right, to the actual medical subject headings that describe the papers that they are referenced in. You can start to do very nice traversal and annotations out of this. It's taken years. These are all the ontologies that are in it. Right? We learned all sorts of annoying things like Sparkle and all these federated query systems don't actually federate yet. If you run a big honking Sparkle query, it'll just start to try to download all the RDF to your local store before it executes the query. We didn't know that. Right? We learned an awful lot about giving unique names to concepts and entities inside databases and how hard it really is. Right? The technology is tractable but painful. Right? And if you want it to scale, it requires being very diligent and being kind of obnoxiously rigorous about how you do stuff. And this is, again, it's not, wasn't very endearing for us to a lot of the people in the semantic web life sciences community when we did it, but our Sparkle endpoint gets 37,000 queries a day now. And there's a minimum of 10 in the wild that we know of, and there's a lot more that we think that we don't know about that are out there. So this is the sort of stuff that works, right? But it only works because we take in completely unambiguously public sources, and we don't distribute anything we don't have the explicit right to distribute. So it's a clean room, essentially, on which you can begin doing federated annotation and listing systems. It's not raw data. This is the sort of compiled data. And I don't think that the metaphor actually ought to be the web. I think the metaphor ought to be the internet. Like, the internet took decades, not years, to go from sort of inception to creating economic value. We've sort of lost our patience because of the web and Web 2.0 and everything else that has a 2.0 behind it. We've lost our patience in systems that actually take a really long time. And if people had been demanding economic value out of the NSFNet in 1983, right, we might not have maintained the sorts of open choices that led us to the point where the web could be created. This is one of the problems with promoting the data web metaphor. A, I don't think we're there. B, I don't think it's actively helpful. I think this is going to need public funding for a sustained period of time, public infrastructure, and a plan that is actually built both by the data management community, by the corporate community, and by the public funders. Right? A plan that is jointly built to transition it, right? Just like George Strawn helped transition the NSFNet to a public system, right, over the latter half of the 1980s. I think that works better than pretending that this is going to magically be like the web, where we're going to have YouTube for data in 5 years. I don't see it. Okay, so I'm kind of a downer today. I apologize. So policy. Policy could be great, right? This is the NIH data sharing policy, right? So NIH reaffirms its support for the concept of data sharing, right? That's heartwarming. You require, if you're seeking $500,000 or more in direct costs in any year, you're expected to include a plan for data sharing or state why data sharing is not possible. Right? There's no bias against you if you choose option number 2. There's no way to track your data sharing plan. The data sharing plans are not made public in association with the grant numbers. Right? There is no metric by which the study session is supposed to evaluate a data sharing plan as being acceptable or not acceptable. Right? There's no follow-up, there's no accountability, and there's no transparency. So we have some nice beginnings in these policies, but we're going to need to see a policy change to make this work, which is, imagine if every grant had a hyperlink to its data sharing plan, and then one where you could email the PI. That's not a very complicated piece of technology to pull off. It's a very complicated piece of sociology to pull off, because that PI doesn't get rewarded for sharing data with you. That PI gets rewarded for the number of papers that the PI kicks out. Right? This is part, again, that document culture that we have, which allowed us to jump to a document web. Right? We don't have that data culture that's going to let us jump to a data web. But the good news is this is starting to move. And I think you're going to see, just like we did with open access to the research literature, the large private biomedical research foundations are going to be pushing on this. I know for a fact that some of the big ones are now believe this is the next space where they have to play a leadership role. And if they are successful in that, then I think you'll see the NIH follow on behind that. But until we can get significant funding to actually pay for the execution of these data management plans, to pay for the sorts of archives that we've heard about, it's going to still be tough sledding. And then privacy. Privacy is like a 2-hour talk. I'll only say that there's an incredible pastiche of international regimes around privacy. And suffice to say that the US is one of the least popular places to keep data because of privacy. The US government has a right to march in on databases and re-identify people because of the Patriot Act. Right? That's enough to keep genome-wide association studies run in Canada out of the United States government databases, because the right to re-identify is explicitly reserved here. This is one of the simpler examples. Imagine if you're trying to take data on genomic resistance to malaria that you gathered in Malawi, analyze it in Germany, send the results to England where it was funded, and then try to share those results back to the Malawian individuals. Right? The chain of de-identification that makes the analysis possible also makes it impossible to go back and tell the individuals whether or not they're okay, whether or not they actually have the resistance, how to develop a local test. Right? There are all of these sort of unintentional but conflicting regimes around privacy. No one that I know has proposed a meaningful solution. So we've got good solutions in tech. They're just annoying, difficult, and boring. Right? We've got solutions in policy. They just require willpower. Right here, I'm not sure what the answer is other than some sort of complicated international contract system that basically maintains paper trails that cover everyone's butt, right, to make sure that you're not sort of violating any legal norms of privacy. I think what we're going to see with efforts like SAGE, which I'm involved in with Liz as well, is we need to begin to develop new norms about what it means to be a participant in a data sharing effort, right, as a citizen, as an NGO, as a funder, as a scientist. And you're going to see these efforts that do model building around individuals are going to begin driving that conversation. Because at the government level, I don't see any hope. I'm not going to put my faith in an international treaty that will come out on data or data privacy. And so if you think about a regime that brings all four of these together at scale, which is what would be required for the data web to come into being, there just aren't that many options. And so what we think is that the most important thing is to actually just eliminate the IP part, right? If we can't simplify the other ones in a way that is that isn't artificial, right? So you can simplify the technology, but it actually defeats the scale of the technology if you do. You can simplify the policy, but it actually devalues the difficulty of the social engineering required to get the change. But I mean, this is the reality in IP, and this is from a guy named Jordan Hatcher at the Open Knowledge Foundation, Open Data Commons. These are folks that we have a disagreement with on data licensing policy. But I love this slide because it shows you've got database rights, copyrights, the handshake represents a contract, you've got the database software, right? And it's really hard to figure out where the rights stop and start. And when you start to run queries that touch on 1,000 databases that all have this graph describing their IP rights, you just get lost. And so the right answer is actually just to cut the IP out completely. Right? It's the only way to bring true simplicity to this model because you can't artificially simplify the other three elements. But we have a tool that does this in IP. It's called the public domain. The public domain is a zone where all the rights are granted, none of the rights are reserved, and where you basically just use scholarly norms to decide whether or not you need to cite somebody as opposed to lawsuit power saying that I'm going to sue you for infringing, which is what would be the case if you used attribution or copyright. So we got onto this at Science Commons in 2007, and we really didn't know whether or not this would take. And we were very grateful in 2010 when the Open Knowledge Foundation and some of the other leaders in open science, Peter Murray Rust, who's here, Cameron Nayland, actually sort of came together and said, you know what, we don't know about data generally. Right? There are people who do street mapping who really want copyleft data licensing. There are people who are doing public sector information who are really unwilling as governments to give up the right to be attributed legally. And that's happening in Australia, it's happening in the UK. But in science, right, if you're going to make a publication about science, you need to make the data that's necessary to replicate that research available in the public domain. And this has begun to get picked up and get traction. Again, we sort of thought this would be a hard sell, but it turns out, at least in the sciences, if you're willing to share your data, you don't tend to sort of need to buy into this ethos of the license creates the freedom. So the biggest example of this was GSK dropping 13,500 compounds that are bioactive against malaria into the public domain. They put it into a public archive. Right? There's a copy in the US, there's a copy in the UK. Right? They took the whole lots of copies, keep stuff safe ethos, and they unambiguously made it available under a public domain dedication, basically saying, you know what, we haven't patented any of these compounds. They may or they may not be useful. No one is ever going to be able to patent them now because all the compositions of matter have been disclosed. And all of the data around that, you can use it, and it would be nice if you would give us a citation, right? But that's it. And so for GSK to do this was a pretty big deal. You know, we take a lot of credit for, you know, SAGE, right? SAGE uses CC0 and the public domain tools as well, but SAGE is a nonprofit. It makes sense that they would do this. You know, the Polar Information Commons is another good example of folks who are sort of, again, saying what we want to do here is make data as widely available as possible. But for companies to jump in and do this was really interesting. And in many ways, you see this in the sciences more so than you see in something like a GPS context. But the idea is to create this unambiguously open corpus so that as people build the technical tools, the systems for annotation that makes things easier, as we learn how to do citation and what have you, that we have a big enough corpus of clean data to do those sorts of experiments in a way that doesn't undermine the long-term survival of the system. Because people will continue doing lightweight Google Maps mashups. People will continue doing sort of weird and funky licensing. That's just human behavior. But if we've got some stuff that's truly open and someone actually cracks a data browser, if we've got this stuff truly open and someone actually cracks the citation system, then we've got a corpus on which we can aggregate around and really go to town. Right? That's the end goal in this. So like my takeaways, I guess, would be don't underestimate the complexity of the data web. I think it is artificially covered over far too often. Second is don't let any of this scare you. This is still worth doing. It's just going to be one day by day, advance by advance, and by using other people's code whenever possible. And I'm going to try to connect you guys to the Sage folks because I think the Sage data needs to be at least a copy of it in a Dataverse, right? The more attempts we make, the more likely we are to win in the long term. And the last bit is that, sort of no matter how much I think there's an overestimation of the data web right now, I don't think there's any way to overestimate it in the long term. Because I think that we are going to inevitably make it to this. There are too many smart people working too hard. There is, although not enough money out there working on this. And the impact of the data network in the long term will be transformative because it's going to let us begin to make predictions about complicated systems that are data-driven instead of belief-driven. And that's what this is all about. And that's why it's been such a pleasure to be here. And I just wanted to thank Microsoft and Lee for the chance to speak.
Thanks for getting that little glint of optimism right at the end. I appreciate that.
Sorry.
I'd actually like to invite all of the speakers up, and then and the three speakers up, and then open it up to questions.
We need to give Liz a mic. I can just do that. You get your own.
Thanks. So I want to talk about the best being the enemy of the good, and about the fact that a lot of times when I hear people talking about how hard it will be to get a data web, what they're actually talking about is metadata about the data. If you look at just releasing data and you don't impose all sorts of requirements about following particular schemas and so on and so forth, a lot of the difficulty goes away. Now, you may not get as much value from that sort of release of data, but what did we see? In England, when they released the minister's expenses as data written on scraps of paper, it rapidly turned into something extremely useful. In the United States, when they released Republican campaign contributions as scanned printouts, those turned into something useful also. It seems like there's tremendous value to just getting that data out first, and all of the emphasis on ontologizing it and following standards and so on and so forth can impose a real deterrent on that initial value gain, even though it may have greater value in the long run.
So I would agree with you completely. Right? I think that the kind of people who are into doing that are typically not the kind of people who are into the ontologizing. In my experience, they actually don't even like each other frequently on an individual level. And so there's no problem to having the two tracks from my perspective. That's why I think it's very useful to have, if we're going to go talk commonly to Congress, raw data now is a great catchphrase, right? Because my catchphrase would never work at the congressional level, right? It's way too detailed. So I don't think there's any conflict between that and what I'm laying out. It's just that I think that there's a difference between benefits we can get from having raw data that have lots of eyes looking at it and the benefits that come from connecting data. And I think they're different problems with different solutions and different people, for the most part. My only hope would be that as people do the mapping of the raw data, if they would simply publish their mappings, that would be pretty cool.
I tend to worry when it's sort of putting the cart before the horse to start talking about all of these sort of large standards and agreements before the data is out there.
Well, I mean, we take a pretty robust theory, which is everything we say we try to hack and release ourselves. It's very instructive.
My question is about sort of negative incentives to sharing, thinking about the scientists who are looking at sort of revenue in terms of reputation or papers published based on data that they want to guard. That's a pretty serious negative incentives given the effort it takes to publish. I'm wondering if you guys have any ideas or comments on how that might be countered.
I guess one of the options is to have a phased embargo release option. So the ePrint software at Southampton, which is used for the crystallographic data in the National Crystallography Service, has an embargo phased process so that the data owner can release it, when they choose. That may go some way to address the point you're making. I don't know.
Maybe there is another incentive. There are some of the studies show that correlate very clearly more citations for a researcher with more basically a higher salary for a faculty member researcher, right? Our approach with generating a formal data citation is that if you add the citations not only to the published work, to the journals, but also to the data itself, it could duplicate the number of citations. And there is an incentive in that recognition of the work that is done by the researchers. So that's.
There's a little evidence, at least from the access to the journals problem, that the funders control the incentives. And so if the funders begin to have a line on their annual review forms that say, give us the URLs of all the data sets you referenced in all your papers, that creates a pretty significant positive incentive to deposit those data sets because you don't want to leave the fields blank. And there is, I think there's probably going to be room for embargoes and for sort of clubs, right, where you share your data with maybe 15 researchers in a club, but the minute you deposit it in the club, a clock ticks, and after 12 months, all that data moves out into the public. I think you're going to see these sort of mixed and phased systems where the funders control some incentives, and then these clubs begin to form that sort of move data halfway towards the public, and it's part of a club for a while where you have to share data to get data, and then after another time period, then it moves out. I think you're going to see a mix of things like that.
There are positives and negatives in coming to meetings like this. The positives are that you hear all the different things that are happening in different entities around the world. The negatives are you hear all these things that are happening in various entities around the world. And the problem becomes then that how do we bring this together? How do we make sure that 20 different people, 20 different institutions are working to solve the same problem without even knowing they're working to solve the same problem? And with the NSF mandate that everyone is scurrying to meet, every institution now is out trying to figure out how to reinvent the wheel, because most of these institutions are totally unaware of what is going on in the field already and are therefore thinking they're creating something new in the environment, which actually is not, of course. So how do we make sure that everything is being coordinated and that there isn't this potential for delay because of the fact that we're just not understanding what various people are doing?
One of the things I've talked about, not in public talks actually, is about funder join-up. It seems to me there's we talk about institutional collaboration, we talk about researcher collaboration, but actually I think there's huge scope for the funders to get together across nations and to look at how their policies can join up, which would help the researcher at the coalface. So that's one thing I can see would be beneficial. Not easy, because it doesn't happen within a country, in my experience, so let alone across nations. But that, I think, would be helpful.
I just want to to give a positive aspect to that, for all the conferences that have been going in the last years, and data citation and data management, I think there is actually a consensus, or there is some convergence that is getting there. So even though all these institutions have been doing different things, the good thing is that now more people are paying attention. A few years ago, I don't think that many people were thinking about, is data publishing even an issue? Why would you do that? I think that now there is at least an acceptance that is important. And well, interestingly enough, we're doing something that is very similar in a way.
And I'm not sure it's a bad thing to have that much froth. I mean, you think about how many years it took us to evolve citation, right, as a system. We're compressing that into a very short period of time as we're demanding enormous results. You know, there were 50-plus hypertext systems in 1990. And so I think that a certain amount of that increases the odds evolutionarily that someone somewhere gets it right and it catches. So, I mean, if it continues for 20 more years, then maybe it's a problem. I think right now there's nothing wrong with a little Precambrian flowering.
What about data that's rather difficult to interpret? Data where the calibration is moving around for quite a while after it's been taken. Data where there are veto sections that depend on looking at the electronic logs. Data that's just got a lot of noise in it and the signal is deep inside. Is it really worth even releasing that kind of data?
Yes.
How do you do it? It's more effort to make it clean than it was to take it in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer. I don't have an easy answer. My instinct is that I sort of go with, it was Dave Karger's point, which is that, you know, in general, if you just release it, then something cool might happen that you didn't expect. You know, I mean,
somebody comes to a wrong conclusion.
Way, right? Sorry.
This is actually one of the major fears that you see expressed about releasing data, is that someone will come to a wrong conclusion.
Yeah, this is pretty big in climate, obviously. Because the signal is so small and the noise is so big.
So this business of having funding agencies require researchers to release data, this incentivizes university researchers, but it doesn't do anything for corporate researchers. So is that fair?
Yeah, I guess it is. But having said that, I would hope that, I mean, I'm not sure which corporates you're referring to, but I would hope that corporates will also review their thinking in the data area. And certainly in the pharma area, there are signs that they are starting to release data more willingly and want to be part of what is essentially a different philosophy, which has some pretty serious moral and ethical benefits for society as a whole, which politically it would be not so good to not be a part of.
I agree with that. It would be nice if the journals were to insist on data release and they ran the data analysis themselves.
Some of them are starting to do that, at least in social science. So you need to add the replication data someplace. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the discipline and the kind of data. I mean, definitely, pharma has for 25 years embraced the public domain as a patent defensive strategy. And so Merck started throwing tons and tons of gene sequences into GenBank in the late 90s to prevent aggressive patenting. The whole industry came together to create a database of single nucleotide polymorphisms, basically to prevent the biotech industry from patenting the genome and then using that to hold up the pharma industry. So I think you're going to see different disciplines, different corporations and sectors using open data for different reasons. But the ability to capture data is getting so cheap, right, in most disciplines, that I think the economic value of securing truly secret data is going to degrade, because I can just replicate it, right? In 10 years, being able to build a GPS map of the world is going to be, you just need a lot of people with an app on their cell phones, right? And that renders the GPS corporate secret database a lot less relevant. So, I mean, that's what happened with the human genome with Celera. I mean, the human genome, the public version was good enough that Celera couldn't sell it, and they wound up dumping their stuff into the public database, as they transitioned into becoming a pharmaceutical company. So But I don't think that. I think that the fact that this is only for academics or whatever, or funded scientists, I think that's a feature and not a bug right now. I think if we needed the corporations to deposit, it would be harder because we don't have the leverage.
You had a question over there?
So I wanted to probe a little bit on this issue of IP and data and walking away from those IP rights. So I'm a physicist by training, and I think we're all sort of used to sort of the scientific idea that the whole point of a publication is that you're giving, in effect, enough information that somebody can reproduce your results. And if they can't reproduce your results, then you haven't really made a contribution. Now, in this sort of new model of science where we're doing our work with data, at the moment it's very hard for us to reproduce each other's results because it's actually really hard for us to get at the exact form of the data massaged in the way that the person used it when they did their paper. And clearly one of our goals here is to sort of regain the high ground, if you will, of having reproducible science in our papers. Now, if you come back to the IP issue, isn't it possible that in doing that, what you do is you establish, what you're in effect doing is establishing the traceability for the data you used in your paper. And you ought to therefore, even if it's not going to show up necessarily in the citation list of your paper, if you were up for promotion and you had a big data set out there that everyone was used, you'd really like to be able to sort of check the literature and see how often it showed up. And the reason I ask this is because some of the sciences actually have a really poor culture of promoting sort of those technical contributions. I mean, the astronomers always astound me with the fact that they have really come up with this group of brilliant astronomers who've made their careers on data systems. That's really not possible in some parts of the earth sciences yet, maybe 10 years from now. And it seems like everything we can do to incentivize that transition is important. So I just wanted to push back a little bit on that IP issue and see whether or not, maybe we're disincentivizing something we don't want to back off on because it's part of that sociological change.
So I agree with everything you said in terms of what needs to happen. I just don't think that IP is the vector, because IP has other consequences, right, that citation and norms don't. So I think if you make it simple and easy to cite data sets, technically, I think, and this is what I love about the Dataverse, is you've got the handle and you've got the fingerprint, right? And those two things together give you a location and an integrity check. And it also gives you something that can be harvested. You can run a Google search or an RSS feed for every time that handle shows up or that fingerprint shows up. I think that works better than an IP system because IP, first of all, doesn't apply very well to data. So if your database is in the United States and you put it on the internet, even if you assign it a copyright, the copyright doesn't exist. I can extract the data, republish it, and give you no credit. Because asserting a copyright over something that's not copyrightable doesn't create a copyright. That data is, as long as that data is not a creative expression in the United States, it is truly free. And so your choice in intellectual property is the public domain or a trade secret. And so when you make it available, it's gone. Now that's not exactly true in Europe. The European Union has a database directive that creates a sui generis, right? It's sort of like this thing we use to protect America's Cup racing hulls, right? Database right. That creates a form of intellectual property right similar to copyright over substantial extraction and reuse of the database contents. That has actually hurt the European database industry, not helped it from an economic perspective compared to the United States. And it has made some things really weird in terms of what happens if you try to promote that and then you actually wind up enclosing the human genome, right, in the name of freedom. So I think I'm dead on with everything you're saying is true. I think this is why we need to have citation metrics for data, right? Because we don't need copyright to make citations powerful in science.
Yeah, maybe sort of that IP framework needs to be a very different framework. But
well, we've sort of conflated intellectual property. We've conflated attribution, which is a legal requirement emerging from copyright, with citation, which is a scientific tradition. And I want to unconflate that. That's sort of what I'm arguing for.
So maybe we change IP for attribution.
Well, or we say simply, so let's take, I've been out, hammering on the public domain for 5 years, but I've got people who can't quite get there, right, in the Australian government, right, or in the UK government. And the answer there is, not you're an evil person, but it's do the least harm possible. So if you're going to use a copyright license, right, use the Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 license, because we've made enough tweaks to it that license doesn't enclose anything that's already in the public domain. It does that sort of in the code. And there's a technical methodology for attribution that avoids the problems that Deb laid out, which is that you can specify a methodology of attribution either like a trackback, right, or by simply saying, only if you copy the whole damn thing do I want you to give me a citation, right? It's up to you to figure out when you need to give me a citation. And that way you haven't waived your intellectual property rights, but you've licensed them in such a way that they're doing the least harm possible. So there's middle ground between the positions I've laid out and a maximalist position. What we're trying to do is to move the debate to get people to think about how to use these technical systems to create new norms rather than sort of falling back on the comfortable shoes of free licenses.
Well, thank you for a really interesting discussion.
And I will reiterate that. Thank you very much to the three speakers and for their generous time and taking some extra questions.